Hey everybody, this is Mike Conforti, aka Manny Faces, host and producer of Newsbeat. We're back here with another episode of BackBeat, the behind-the-scenes look at our podcast. Of course, this podcast is an unconventional look at conventional wisdom. You can find us on the web at usnewsbeat.com, and of course, you can subscribe to our podcast wherever you find your favorite podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, etc. As always, I'm joined for our behind-the-scenes look at our episodes with our editor-in-chief, Mr. Chris Twarowski.
What up, Manny?
And, of course, our managing editor, Rashed Mian.
Hey.
How you doing, guys? So, listen, we're here discussing our latest episode. We titled it Radical Caucasian Extremism. The full title the full title is Misunderstanding Terrorism, Exposing Radical Caucasian Extremism. And it's a sort of an interesting look at the amount of coverage and, I guess, public perception that might be surrounding the different types of extremism, terrorism, violent aggression that takes place in our society as a whole, and where some of those perceptions may be a little skewed. So we look at that in this episode. This episode sort of grew out of another episode in a way, right? So we had the hijacking jihad episode, which spoke about the word jihad and how that word has sort of been misconstrued throughout media and throughout
even the extremists
themselves sort of use jihad as a term to sort of signify a holy war or death to everyone but us kind of deal. And it's not really the true meaning of the word. You should check out that episode. Hijacking jihad really goes into it in a great way. And one of the voices on that episode, Ms. Daisy Khan, who spoke very eloquently about the topic, she invited us to Washington, D.C. to kind of present that episode at a summit that she had put together that coincided with the release of a report. It was the Wise Up Summit and the Wise Up Report. And this was basically a very well-researched document that went into pretty much the same things about how Islam is being portrayed by the media or just the general perception of Islam and how those perceptions are, again, skewed and could be corrected. Yep. Some efforts to try and...
actual theology versus what's being said
in
the media and, comparing those things.
Right. And
which was the subject of an entire BackBeat as well.
Yes, indeed. So a little background to the BackBeat. Lets us know that we were in Washington, D.C., and while we were there, we interviewed some people, and those interviews essentially came together to form this episode. So it was interesting.
Yeah, we met award-winning independent journalist, political commentator, broadcaster, and author Mehdi Hassan there,
right?
Who's currently the host of several shows on Al Jazeera English, also writes a column for The Intercept, and contributes to The Guardian.
Okay.
We spoke to Sammy Rangel and Tony McAleer there, in a crowded hallway just outside the main conference room. And that's, for listeners, that's all that crazy noise and voices, weird voices that you hear in the background.
Real on-the-scene reporting there.
Yeah, so they're both the co-founders of the nonprofit Life After Hate.
Right.
And they're also both former white supremacists. Mm-hmm. Really important perspective that they give to this. And then although his interview didn't make the final cut, we also spoke with Saeed Khan, who's a lecturer at Wayne State University and an expert in Middle and Near East history and politics.
But you can hear him in the BackBeat. You can hear Saeed Khan in the BackBeat that we did exclusively about the Wise Up.
Right, but we did speak to him for the BackBeat. That was a special on-scene roundup, a reporting from the Wise Up Summit.
Correct.
Okay, correct. So
Correct.
You guys can check that out as well.
And all of the aforementioned were panelists at the Wise Up Summit.
Indeed. Who else did we bring into this episode? The professor.
We had Charles Kurzman, who I've been following for several years now, writing and reporting about extremism and issues involving the Muslim American community, because unfortunately those two things have become tied together.
Right.
But Professor Kurzman, every year he comes out with a study basically detailing the number of Islamic extremist attacks in the United States, and he compares that to the total number of murders that have happened in the country. And a lot of times you'll see that fluctuate from like 14,000 to maybe 17,000. So Professor Kurzman, one of the things that he's trying to get across is, extremism is bad on both sides, Islamic and right-wing. One thing that he likes to say is that, we should look into right-wing extremism more than we do as a society and media and government. And then he also compares that to the actual numbers for 2016 in particular, when he looked at that, the Islamic extremist attacks were 1/3 of 1% of all the murders in the United States. So if you let that sink in a little bit, then you really try to contemplate, why as a society we're always up in arms about these things. Obviously, it's horrific and it's tragic when these things happen, but why don't we also talk about the mass shootings in that regard,
right,
and other murders in the country?
Right. So let me ask the significance of this episode, especially in this era of Trump and the reawakening of white supremacy in America. I think, obviously Charlottesville, a number of other incidents that are mentioned in the episode itself. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I'll begin with the premise of the episode, which we also outlined in our cover story at usnewsbeat.com, that basically since September 11th, conventional wisdom holds that Muslim extremists pose the biggest threat to national security, and trillions have been spent waging the so-called war on terror in response. Secret surveillance has become ubiquitous, with law enforcement targeting innocent Muslim Americans. They've been spied on at mosques, at work, at restaurants. There's been multiple congressional committees held on the threat of Islamic extremism, including a series of sessions, so-called Muslim radicalization sessions that Rashed and I covered in D.C., which was led by the then chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Peter King.
Right.
Yet, when you look at the figures...
Right, this was what Rashed was alluding to, the numbers.
Right, the numbers. From September 12th, 2001 through December 31st, 2016, right-wing extremists carried out 62 violent attacks, which killed 106, while 23 incidents were attributed to Islamic extremists, with a death toll of 119, according to the U.S. Government Accountability Office.
Right.
And up until the summer of 2015, deaths caused by non-Muslims in extremist attacks dwarfed those in which Muslims were fingered as the perpetrators, 48 to 26. Then there was another analysis by the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute and the Center for Investigative Reporting that discovered there were a combined total of 115 successful and foiled right-wing plots between 2008 and 2016, 1/3 of which were thwarted. And during that same period, there were 63 cases of Islamic domestic terror. So it's this Islamic extremism narrative that's been sort of drilled into our collective heads by politicians and mainstream media. And it's these aforementioned facts and stats that don't receive so much attention.
Right.
In the episode, we mentioned for context that prior to 9/11, the deadliest act of terrorism committed on American soil was the Oklahoma City bombing in April 1995, which killed 168 people, including 19 children, and remains to this day the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in U.S. history. We think it's important to remember, too, who was responsible for that. Timothy McVeigh, a white Gulf War vet, raised Roman Catholic. He detonated a 5,000-pound truck bomb, and his only regret was that he didn't blow up the entire building. So you mentioned the importance of this episode in the age of Trump. Well, it's important for us to at least try to correct or counter this prevailing narrative.
Right. Yeah, and I think, and this week when we put it out, it came sort of right after President Trump retweeted those the anti-Muslim videos that had come out of the account of a fringe party in Britain called Britain First.
Right.
And again, this speaks to the as Chris said, the importance of the episode. When you have the president of the United States, the quote leader of the free world and the most powerful person in the world, basically, retweeting videos that are Islamophobic and have no context. And at least one of the videos, it was determined almost immediately that that person that was supposedly a migrant was actually born and raised in the Netherlands.
Right.
So that's the context. That's why it's important for us to talk about these issues.
He's participating in this. In other words,
right.
It's coming from the highest levels of government now, where
right.
the narrative is being put out there.
Yeah, and then the response from the White House is, well, yeah, it doesn't have to be real, which is funny coming from a White House that yells and screams about so-called fake news. It doesn't have to be real, but he's just raising the alarm about an issue that's important to America.
Right. The threat is real.
The threat is real. Well, then if the threat is real, then why aren't we also talking about right-wing extremism? We're here not to say, all right, let's overlook extremism from one side. We're saying, there's a disproportionate amount of attention and funding and that goes towards Islamic extremism. When
we have this other issue that,
as Chris went through the numbers, and when you hear it, and if it's somebody that doesn't really follow this issue, you're like, wow. There's been more attacks, right-wing attacks in the United States since 9/11 than Islamic attacks. I would have no idea.
Right, and let's talk about some of those right-wing attacks that have happened in the past couple of years and more recently. Of course, I mentioned Charlottesville. We also had Charleston, probably the two most talked about, right-wing attacks in modern history. What other cases do you think haven't gotten the same kind of coverage?
Well, I will start, though, even though the AME church shooting in Charleston, South Carolina has been covered widely.
Right.
I think, to me, that was sort of my awakening. So as a reporter before Newsbeat, that for some reason that tragedy just affected me in some way. So, I went out, I was talking to people who lead AME churches throughout the country, and then you realize this is one of the oldest churches in the United States. It was born out of a movement, because even before the Civil War, Black Methodists were, looked down upon by white Methodists, in the South especially. So they created their own church. So, an attack on an AME church, and this one was already a historic church,
right,
is significant. So we've had other attacks that they were covered in the news, but not as widely as you would say, a Boston Marathon bombing or something like that. So you have,
and not as part of this arc of a continual stream of such attacks,
right?
Sort of like,
and it's also not even the coverage; it's also how those people are covered. So you have the Colorado Springs Planned Parenthood attack. So that occurred in November 2015, and that killed 3 people, including a police officer.
Right.
And that was the attacker at that time was Robert Louis Deere, and he made comments about dead babies and baby body parts, and about how Planned Parenthood was killing babies through abortion. And an independent observer would consider that person to be a right-wing extremist, because he's holding up, he's sort of bringing to reality this narrative that liberals and people affiliated with Planned Parenthood are baby killers. And then he goes out and actually acts upon those extremist beliefs and kills innocent people inside this Planned Parenthood. So you would, in the context of terror, and terror is such an ambiguous term that there's really no definition, and that's why people yell and scream. Well, if there's a mass shooting and there seems to be some reason socially or politically why that person carried out an attack that way, why aren't we calling it terror? So Robert Louis Deere, for the sake of a conversation, people were calling it terror. I don't even think he was even charged with terror, and he was charged with the murders, but then he was held. He had a court hearing, and he was held incompetent to stand trial, of course. But this guy, he made these comments, and you could see, they seem crazy, but doesn't someone who believes that the Quran is driving them to kill people also seem a little crazy?
Right.
But we don't talk about people like that.
Right.
You've also had, and so speaking of that, you had in October 2016, you had an anti-government militia that had plans to target a mosque in Kansas, and an apartment complex also, because this was an apartment complex where Somali immigrants live. So there's at least 3 men in this Kansas militia that wanted to bomb the place and blow it up. Luckily, the government, the FBI, had a criminal informant inside who was able to pass along this information to law enforcement to thwart the attack before it actually happened.
And wasn't this something to do with the election around that time?
Yeah. So the crazy thing is, and this doesn't come out explicitly, but you could sort of see the messaging here, where one of the attackers said he wanted to do it on November 9th, 2016, which was the day after the presidential election. Why did he want to do it after the election? Because, not to affect the outcome. If it's seen that maybe someone who perhaps is a supporter of Donald Trump committed an attack on a mosque, that would not look good for the candidate at that time. Right. And I believe it was this very same person who also said the only good Muslim is a dead Muslim.
Wow.
Again, a political reason for an attack,
right,
and not charged with terror. And obviously you've had other recent examples where you had the horrific, this one, I think, to me, it was one of the most heartbreaking, the commuter train attack in Portland, where this one guy just started berating a woman wearing a hijab, which is a traditional Islamic head covering. And there's these 3 good Samaritans came up and sort of try to calm the situation down.
Yeah.
And for that heroic attempt, 2 of them were stabbed and killed. and they died. And that attacker's name is Jeremy Christian. And he was the one that, if you hear in the episode, he's the one that it's in the intro, the cold open, which was amazing, by the way. In which there's somebody yelling in a courtroom about Antifa, the group that's anti-fascist, death, and then saying you call it terror, I call it freedom or whatever
Patriotism.
it was, patriotism.
Yeah.
So that was Jeremy Christian. He was the one that attacked those three Good Samaritan in Portland. And you also had this. So if you go to usnewsbeat.com, and we also release a story with each podcast. We start that article with this incident in North Carolina in October. It was just days after the shooting in Las Vegas at the concert that killed dozens of people. And there was a man who was arrested who's actually got into the airport, placed a bomb in the airport, and thankfully law enforcement was able to intercede before the bomb detonated. But in his criminal complaint, he actually said he, quote, allegedly, quote, said he wanted to start a war on U.S. soil. Which right away, that also, if there was a Muslim person who planted a bomb in an airport and said he wanted to start a war in U.S. soil, you wouldn't hear the end of it.
Right.
So there's a lot of reasons for we'll maybe dive into the coverage aspect in a little bit, but these are just some instances that people may have sort of came across on their news feed or as a brief aside on news at night. But these are serious incidents that have occurred.
Absolutely. Chris, what do you think about that? What do you think prevents some of these incidents from getting the kind of attention that others do?
Well, it's hard to say definitively, but I think we can say confidently that there's a disproportionate attention on incidents involving Muslims in the U.S.
Right.
In some cases, it could be that these plots weren't successful. So you can imagine that a successful airport bombing would have likely generated national and international news coverage.
Right.
But whether it would have broken through such thing as all the Russian news is hard to say. And, when these incidents are covered, it's interesting to watch how the media reports, on the attackers. When it's a Muslim, there's immediately suspicion about terror affiliation, or at least being inspired by a group like ISIS, right?
Right.
When there's a right-wing attacker, or even a mass shooter, which are typically white men, they're often described as lone wolves with mental imbalances.
Right.
Then the media digs and digs and digs to learn more about the suspect to try and gain a better understanding, which is appropriate. But when the shooter is Muslim, what you see a lot of times is just, quote, the shooter is Muslim.
That's the reason.
That's the reason.
That explains that explains everything.
It ends right there,
Right.
Now back to you, Wolf.
One thing I wanted to add, I think part also of why isn't, let's just say, sovereign citizen movement
right
a common household name as much as Muslim terrorist?
Right.
When you look into it, so
and this is why we titled the episode why we did, because it's a sort of a play on with Trump and a lot of other
let's call it what it is.
Let's call it what it is. We have to say the words radical Islamic terrorism.
If you don't say it, you can't believe it.
Right, but then what these things are, and that's why we named the episode Radical Caucasian Extremism.
Right, exactly.
It's sort of like that's what it is. So call it what it is as well. Sound the same kind of alarm for those type of incidents, but you don't quite hear it as much. The sovereign citizens,
right, which is just one of So when we talk of right wing extremism, we're talking. There's so many different groups.
Right. But if it's not Ku Klux Klan, it's not a household name.
Right.
Yeah.
Like white supremacist anti-government militias.
Right.
Sovereign citizen movement. For those who may not know, recent estimates put the numbers at over 300,000 of these people who they don't recognize the U.S. government. So,
right. And you're talking about 300,000 citizens, like people who live here in the country, like within the borders of this country,
domestic residents.
Not, in some faraway country that are trying to, kill us and end our way of life. These are people who are here.
Right. And this is a group that historically ends up near the top of these lists.
Yeah.
Law enforcement knows about
threats
it, but
to
the
law
general public
enforcement.
doesn't.
Right. And just one example of the type of violence that these groups, unleash. In 2010, Sovereign Citizen made a brief splash in the news when two police officers pulled over a suspicious vehicle for a license plate check, and a 16-year-old, as his father, who was driving, started arguing with the police. 16-year-old comes out with an AK-47 and slaughters the police. These are the type of threats that are out there every single day that do not get the same attention as Islamic extremism.
Right.
Yeah, and we're not trying to stereotype here by calling it radical Caucasian extremism.
Right.
We're just saying, mass shootings are mostly carried out by white men.
Right.
The Vegas shooting. We could go back, Sandy Hook, Columbine, Arizona.
Right.
I mean, you could just get Aurora, Colorado.
Right.
These are not brown people. If they were, obviously these crimes got a lot of attention, but there's a lot of fear when that person is brown, and there's a lot of fear mongering, and then politicians use that to drive support, to get votes.
Yeah, and when you have the president, stating, "I think Islam hates us," that does a lot of different things. But one thing it definitively does is it demonizes all Muslims.
Right.
You're
not saying I think all white men hate us.
Right.
You're, because when there's an equal, if not more, amount of incidents happening by those people.
Right. You're demonizing families.
Right. Of course,
mothers, fathers, children.
Of course, it's just not based in, and it's not based in fact.
Rashed and I have reported on this over the years. I mean, resoundingly, you have leading Islamic scholars and imams coming out, issuing reports saying they're not even really Muslims, ISIS and Al Qaeda. They're perverting our religion.
Right.
How much coverage does that get?
Right. They're also killing Muslims.
Right. The most victims in terror attacks are Muslims, because these are mostly happening in other countries.
Sure.
And Chris sort of mentioned it, just sort of when he was talking about the coverage. But it's also interesting when you watch the content of the coverage. He mentioned how there's these deep dives when white men shoot up places, and you really want to learn why would they do that. And the same thing doesn't always happen when the shooter is Muslim. And then I think one of the biggest examples here is Omar Mateen, who he's the one that shot up the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. That was a horrific shooting that killed, I think, 49 people and then injured, dozens of others. It came out in reports that he had, quote, pledged allegiance to ISIS. But there was other factors within his life that people were sort of slowly digging up. There may have been an issue, with sexual orientation, and there may have been other factors involved. But it's sort of like Chris said, when the guy claims to have pledged allegiance to ISIS and grew up as a Muslim, the conversation sort of ends there, and he's seen as a so-called Islamic extremist.
Right. And then sometimes these incidents, they take that portion of it, or that portion of the perception, to then talk about the need for a travel ban, or something like that. So let me ask you, obviously the extremism has been around forever. It's nothing new. What does law enforcement and government do to try to better understand the nuances of some of the people that are committing some of these actions, and separate, I guess, that fact from fiction, or that hype from reality?
Right. Well, you said, like you said, extremism has been around forever. I mean, there's even, groups that the FBI, likes to consider extremists when they're not, going back into history. But for the real extremist groups, the people that have dangerous motivations, they're investigating these groups. They have criminal informants in there, and that's how they got the guys in Kansas before the plot came about. But the government, it was really under the Obama administration that started something called Countering Violent Extremism. In short, it's called CVE. And the concept of that is to sort of bring together academics, law enforcement, government officials, people within the community, even teachers and educators, and try to get this stuff into schools to better understand extremism as a whole.
Right.
When this came out, though, some Muslim advocacy groups came out saying, this is a little problematic because you're saying this is about extremism. And right now we're looking at the numbers, and the numbers say that at that point that there was more people killed in right-wing attacks than in Islamic attacks, going back to like 2014 and 2015. The Omar Mateen shooting put that number over, I don't want to make this like it's a scoreboard, but that's when it became more Islamic extremist attacks. But they were saying, why are you focusing so much on the Islamic part of this, and why aren't you looking at extremism as a whole?
Was that what the program was sort of to do, to kind of de-radicalize?
Yeah, so they wanted to de-radicalize. They want to learn, what drives someone to extremism.
Right. Which is important, especially when you talk about people who are, again, this travel ban situation doesn't prevent people who are here already and get radicalized, which we've seen happen.
Right.
Muslim extremists do become radicalized here. it's a thing that happens. But again,
but there's a lot of factors. Like I
Right.
said, like I keep bringing up Omar Martin. There's a lot of things wrong with that guy
Right.
that drove him to do what he did.
It's
It
not-
may
it's not the end all
necessarily
be
just
all.
been about him just pledging allegiance to
right.
ISIS. And there could be, people. I'm sorry, are motivated by things that the United States does abroad.
Right.
But that stuff doesn't get talked about a lot. So there's a lot of reasons that go into why someone is driven to such a rage that they actually commit an act of violence like this.
and that's
But-
what that program should be kind
Yeah,
of taken
and-
into consideration.
And some Muslims,
The full spectrum.
Right. When I was covering it, some Muslim groups or some people were like, you know what? At least the government at this point is being inclusive. They're bringing us in to the White House. So that's where this was. One of the first summits was in the White House.
Right.
Obama was at this summit. Secretary John Kerry was at this summit. And, it was bringing everybody together. So, like, you know what?
At least we're at the table. At least
Right,
we're talking,
we're at the
right.
table. So if it's a choice of us staying outside and letting them be the judge of who is and what is an extremist, it's better for us to be inside. There's other people who said, you know what, this is just perpetuating this perceived threat that Muslims are violent, and because of that, we need to understand why they would become extremists. Not analyzing the people that are the extremists, but what are the signs for someone to become an extremist?
And that could be something that could be applied across the board.
Right,
This would be
exactly.
just any people exhibiting certain signs or certain experiences or certain red flags could be why you're going to become a Muslim extremist or a right-wing extremist. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then so they had this. They created this group and this organization. Then it just came out after President Trump was elected. Reportedly, this hasn't been made official yet.
Wait, let me guess. He's going to undo it.
Yeah, exactly. There's been reports that he's going to undo the right-wing extremism part. So it's not really countering violent extremism. It's
Countering Muslim
violent Muslim violent extremism now. So I just wanted you to. So you take that part of it, and then you take a group like Life After Hate, who the two guys that we interviewed for this episode,
Right.
And after the Trump administration came into office, these were guys who relied on funding from the government. Mostly, almost 100% of their funding came from the U.S. government. They weren't getting any funding.
Right.
Why is that the group that's trying to rehabilitate former extremists like themselves, bring them back into society,
Right.
and have them understand, what they were doing was likely wrong, and
Right.
and let them become better people.
Right.
And why is that group losing money?
Right. And maybe pay that forward and
Wouldn't
start
that
to
be
get people,
countering violent extremism?
Right.
I think where politicians and the mainstream media drop the ball, we have groups such as Life After Hate, such as WISE, which stands for the Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality, who combat this narrative with education,
Right.
And dialogue. Testament to this is a story that both Rangel and McAleer from Life After Hate shared with us at the summit that didn't make the cut for the episode. They told us about a man in Buffalo, New York, who was contemplating committing, quote, a violent act of extremism against a mosque, who had somehow found their group.
Life After Hate.
Life After Hate.
Yeah.
And that person agreed to meet with Rangel and the group and be part of an intervention.
So he was planning on something, and then he said he found them and said
somehow he found them and said,
"Help me."
Yeah,
like-
I'm feeling these, having these emotions. I'm feeling about acting out.
Right.
And a dialogue was opened. Both parties came together, and he was able to reconcile within himself.
Right.
And thus, an attack was averted. Education,
Yeah.
communication,
Yeah.
dialogue.
Right, and as Chris is mentioning, he's mentioning the Wise Up Summit. So what I was referring to was countering violent extremism, which was a government program.
Right.
Okay, and then you had people like Daisy Khan at Wise, who it's a private group that's trying to do the same thing, basically.
Right.
The interesting thing that I found, I don't know if you guys sort of noticed it too, but when we were at the summit, we were practically the only news organization there, and there was a lot of headliner names there that people could talk to, report on. If you really want to get a sense of what this so-called Islamic extremism is about or whatever, these would be the people to talk to. But, there weren't media outlets there to cover this. And it's sort of unfortunate because what WISE is doing is they're developing a program that they could take nationwide and talk to people and say, no, this is what this term, like jihad, this is what that means.
Right.
This is what ISIS is doing. They show you how ISIS is trying to recruit people who may be disenfranchised or just impressionable youth who are in danger of they live on the internet and they see these things happening. They're like, wow, there's a so-called Islamic state, like an actual state where I'll be accepted, which is fraudulent to begin with. So you have the government trying something, you have the public, a private entity trying to do something, but that message still hasn't gone across. And to me, it's frustrating as an observer because we spend so much time talking about extremism on cable news, reading the newspaper, and you'll see, and I think I've mentioned this before, you're having a debate about extremism, and why isn't there a Muslim scholar there? I mean, there's been years ago when ISIS sort of...
Oh, like on the TV shows.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the Talking Heads.
Exactly. Why
Right.
isn't it... You just have... so-called law enforcement experts talking about it. And there was over 100 Muslim scholars at one point that came out rebuking everything that ISIS says line by line, taking it from the Quran. That wasn't covered. So
Right.
if you're wondering, like, hey, these guys just did a jihad episode, why are they doing this?
Right.
we're just saying, we need to actually start, contextualizing these things and look a little deeper. Let's not get caught up in, in the hysteria
Right.
and the emotions. Let's look at the numbers and let's try to figure out what's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want, and again, let me just reiterate what you're saying. We're not saying that one isn't a problem. We're saying it looks like the other is a problem too.
Right.
And should be treated with at least the same kind of attention
Right.
and concern, because we are finding that all too often these incidents do happen on our soil, committed by our citizens.
Yeah, and what we're seeing is a sort of what we've seen over the years is a trend. That's a double standard with everything.
Right.
A Muslim man commits an attack. For example, the guy who drove over people in Lower Manhattan recently.
Right.
And within hours, and the next day, Donald Trump was out there talking about how we need the wall, how Senator Chuck Schumer is failing us, how we need his travel ban. He was talking about how every time there's an ISIS-inspired attack, we're going to hit them 10 times harder.
Right. Meanwhile, this guy was from a country that
I think
isn't
it was
in the
Uzbek-
travel
I think
ban.
it may have been Uzbekistan or something.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you say that because there's been studies done. I don't want to go too off base here, but the studies that have been done that's shown that people that have come from these countries that are in the travel ban haven't actually committed terror attacks in the United States. But separately, so you have Donald Trump with such vigor talking about what he wants to do to respond to these attacks.
Right.
But when there's a mass shooting, he gets in front of a camera. He's looking at teleprompters while he's reading, and he quote unquote looks presidential, and he's talking about how sad and tragic this is. And then when there's a press conference and you say, "So, Mr. President, what are we going to do about gun violence in America?" They say it's too soon to talk about gun violence in America,
Right.
but it's not too soon to talk about an attack committed by someone who's obviously not right in the head. So there's that double standard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to that point, Charles Kurtzman, during the interview, told us about a guy in Pittsburgh who had more than a dozen pipe bombs in his home, as well as Nazi literature.
Right.
Who was planning a massive massacre. Eric Charles Smith was his name, and had you guys ever heard of that?
I tell you, he said in the episode, he goes, "I'll give you one that you haven't heard of," and he gave me one I hadn't heard of.
I thought I would have heard it when he said it. But I never heard of that one.
And he said it very eloquently in the episode that 20-something pipe bombs,
now
locked and loaded, ready to go.
And he proposed the scenario. Had that guy been Muslim,
Right. It would have furthered, because I think it would have furthered the narrative that a lot of people in powerful positions are really making the effort to put out there. Again, what the president says, whether you agree with him or not, on any particular item that he might be tweeting about or talking about, it's going to get attention. The people who support him are going to revel in it. The
33%.
If that. But then the rest of us are going to hear it, because it's going to be reiterated by the media, who maybe are either just reporting it straight, hey, this is what he said, or maybe giving a liberal lean to it, saying, here's what he said, and this is why it's crazy. But we're going to hear it. At the end of the day, I know it doesn't matter what you think about what's being said. It's put out there, and it becomes part of this kind of overall background noise that you're always hearing, you're always, being subject to. And that's got to be influential even to people who, again, when we put these episodes together, and listeners will probably agree, even if we're 100% aligned with the message of this episode, we didn't even think about it that way. Like it's more pervasive than we probably think. And we're newsies, we're into it, but I think for the general public, even if you're like on the, you understand the difference between ISIS and Islam. Even if you're just that kind of person, you understand that one does not equate the other. You probably don't realize how much you're being subject to this kind of, narrative.
Yeah, I mean, look, his retweeting is just an example. I mean, he retweets that thing. It causes a firestorm for a couple of days, and then Michael Flynn gets pleads guilty to a crime, and then everybody forgets about it. We're not really talking about it anymore. If it was any other president, though,
right? Well,
you'd likely still be talking about him retweeting something from a fringe far-right group in Britain. And, I think it's important to put out there. We all remember before Brexit, there was the politician who was shot and killed right before Brexit, and that shooter yelled Britain first.
Right, was possibly affiliated or at least sympathetic to that cause.
So again, that's why the president of the United States probably, in a perfect world, wouldn't be retweeting that stuff.
Right. Well, that's it. Listen, this is why we should be elected president. Because we are still talking about it. We are making sure that
Silent Night for president.
Silent Night for president.
Well, Liquid.
You know what? Liquid for president.
Can we talk about Liquid real quick?
Shouts to Liquid, our artist for this episode. Obviously, the musical aspect of Newsbeat is what makes us even more betterer than if we didn't have it. Liquid is new to our presentation, but not new to me. I've known Liquid for a long time. She's a seasoned performer. She's a hip hop fusion artist. She rocks with a band. She rocks with jazz cats. She's a soloist. She's a DJ, and she's incredibly smart. She's just a great person, and it was such a blessing to have her contribute in the way that she did to this episode.
And that being said, you've known her for years, and even when she gave us at least that first verse, where she took the perspective of a white supremacist, which surprised all of us. Yeah, you were even shocked by that.
I was. I said, it's always good to go from Silent Night's done it in the Exonerated and Broke episode, where he kind of he sort of imagines himself as being someone in that the episode is kind of talking about.
Yep.
But Liquid, man, she leveled up on that one, and she came from a different angle, and it was really impressive, and I think it just drove the point home. So once again, thanks to Liquid for her amazing contribution. If she's willing, I think we'll have her back again for something in the future. Speaking of the future, we are knee-deep in the middle of working on our next episode. I just want to say thank you if you've been following us through our first year. Pretty much, we're kind of coming down to the end of the year. We did start this in January with our pilot episode, and then, of course, we ramped up in the middle of the year. So if you've been following us, you've heard the bunch of episodes we have. We thank you. If you're just coming across us now, stay tuned. And for all of you, this last episode of the year is going to be quite a doozy. Now, we like to concentrate our episodes into short time spans, perfect for your commute. 16 minutes is a sweet spot for the meat of the episode. Most don't go past 20 overall. This one is going to be longer. It is going to be very informative, very involved, and it's going to sound awesome. So I'm excited. I think you guys are excited. We're super excited about this one. So stay tuned for that, and that'll be on the podcast feed, wherever you subscribe to your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and various other podcast apps. You can get us. And, of course, you can always check our full stories that accompany every main episode at usnewsbeat.com. You can listen to them there as well. If you're not if you don't like the podcast app thing but just want to jump on our website, you can do that as well. usnewsbeat.com. You can contact us there if you want to send us some praise, if you want to know where to send cash donations and bourbon. And you can also give us any tips, that you might think we might be interested in looking at. Taking an unconventional look at conventional wisdom. That's what we do here at Newsbeat, and we make it sound damn good. So thanks again. Really, truly appreciate your ears. And share this podcast around with your friends, neighbors, supporters, and haters.
Their ears?
I appreciate your ears.
That's so weird.
No, they're good ears.
No.
If you have, nothing
they have
better.
The best ears?
Best ears. Our listeners have the best ears. So once again, thank you for checking us out. We'll be back very, very soon. usnewsbeat.com. My name is Manny Faces. For Chris and Rashed, catch you next time. Peace.
Newsbeat is produced and distributed by MP Studios, a division of Maury Publishing. The producer of Newsbeat is Michael Conforti. The editor-in-chief of Newsbeat is Christopher Twarowski. The managing editor of Newsbeat is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Maury. Show notes are available on usnewsbeat.com. Subscribe today on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.